Welcome back to James Cameron 101. I'm your host, Eddie Green. Today is another special episode here on the podcast. I'm being joined by a close collaborator of Cameron, which is always very exciting when the podcast is able to have somebody on that literally worked with Cameron himself, kind of helps validate the whole podcast and really, just brings home the goal of everything I'm trying to do here. Today, we're going to be talking with Ed W. Marsh.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to James Cameron.
I almost bailed on being a filmmaker. It's about sitting in that big dark room with all those other people you don't know, and something's going to come up on that screen that's going to take you somewhere. I'm the king of the world!
If you were to take a peek at The Abyss, you'll notice there is a documentary included on that called Under Pressure, Making the Abyss. He is the writer-director of that one. He also, to my understanding, co-directed the making of Terminator 2 Judgment Day. He did Reflections on Titanic, which is on the Blu-ray. More recently, on the 4K for Titanic, you have Stories from the Heart. And also, he is featured here on Ghost of the Abyss. I believe he's a co-editor, and he is a creative producer, which I'll ask him about that, what that is, because I'm familiar with producing, but a creative producer, that's a very interesting term. So without further ado, Ed Marsh.
Hello.
Good to have you on the pod.
Happy to be here. As I said when we first met, two Eds are better than one.
Yes, this is true. What is, if you don't mind me asking, what's the W?
It stands for Walker.
Walker.
My father was one of 8 kids, and his little brother, the youngest in the family, was named after the family doctor because they ran out of family names. So I'm named after him. So I'm technically Ed W. Marsh II. No one cares. Walker.
Well, there we go. And that's so 2 Eds are better than one, and 2 Ed Juniors are better than one because I'm a junior as well. So
fantastic. Excellent.
Meant to be. But no, you are here because Van Ling, who has been on the podcast previously twice already, he told me that you would be a great person to talk to. And so kind of, just a few weeks later, here we are.
Excellent.
So
well, I have to say, I consider Van one of my dearest friends in the world. We met in film school. We did a ton of stuff together, and we are both sort of simultaneously responsible for at least the starts of our careers, and certainly our work with Jim. Do you mind if I tell a little bit of a story? And Van might have told this himself.
Yeah, go ahead.
It'll be interesting to compare because we haven't talked about it in decades. Van was a year ahead of me in school, and I ended up staying 2 years in school. So he was out of school, having graduated, and he was a little bit frustrated that he wasn't getting to work on the kinds of films that he gravitated towards, which were visual effects films. He loved visual effects as long as I've known him. And so we had actually pretty much just seen Aliens. What was that? The summer of 86, is that right? 87,
right.
86?
Okay. 86, yep.
And I said to him, Van, build yourself a resume piece. You love making models. Build something that you can take around to the visual effects houses and show them what you can do. You'll at least get an interview. You'll meet these people, and you'll have a better chance of getting on a project. In fact, you love that power loader thing from Aliens. Build that. Okay, he gets a little twinkle in his eye, and I start to not see as much of him. And I hear that he's spending time up at his parents' house up in Palos Verdes, and then slowly over time, certain of my friends start disappearing for long weekends. And right around Halloween of that year, I was holding a party, and Van comes and he says, hey, I built a power loader. It's down in my truck. Do you want to come see it? And I said, absolutely. And then someone very cleverly distracts me so that by the time I get downstairs, walking down the street in a full-size power loader is Van Ling.
Wow.
Now, it was made of foam core and balsa wood and was definitely sort of a homebrew affair, but it was absolutely majestic and it was absolutely ambitious. He won some sort of costume contest that totally paid for everything that he purchased to make it. He ended up meeting Gail Ann Hurd, and Jim was looking for a research assistant, hired Van, And a couple of years later, when I got out of school, The Abyss was starting pre-production and was about to go into production. And he said, if you can get to South Carolina, I can probably get you the job as the on-set video tap operator. So when they're working underwater, they wanted to record takes and be able to play them back. This was before it was as easy as it is today. And so I got there, and that was my start on the film. So my very first show out of film school was The Abyss. And I have Van to thank for that opportunity. And in a tiny way, he has me to thank for that opportunity. Now, whatever has happened since is both of our own responsibilities. But it was an excellent sort of genesis for both of us, I think.
Yeah. Wow. No, I don't think he told that story. That would have that is so cool. Yeah. So the Abyss is sort of like you said, that is the jumping off point.
Yes.
When it comes to your collaborations with you would call them collaborations with Cameron, right? Like they are 100% collaborations.
Well, I think he would call them collaborations, but there is no question it is Jim's vision.
Right.
If you are working for Jim, you are doing the best you can to sort of help facilitate what he is trying to do. There's a great quote, which I've always loved, which I think applies to Jim in a way. It's by George Bernard Shaw. I actually have it written down here, so I thought I would want to make a reference to it. And it's from his Man, Superman. And being the sexist that he is, George Bernard Shaw definitely makes it a male thing, but it's certainly not unique to males. But he says, the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. And I think that kind of sums up a lot of the way Jim works, because he has a plan, he knows what's possible, or he believes what's possible, and then he sort of wills it into existence. Sometimes easily, sometimes with a lot of support, and sometimes kicking and screaming with everyone else saying it's impossible until he makes it work.
Right.
So
Okay.
that's useful or not, but that's a perspective that I've had for him for a long time.
Right. So when you think of Under Pressure, which is the name of the documentary, featured on The Abyss, and like I said, it's at least on the 4K. I don't know if it's on previous iterations of like a DVD or.
Well, that came into existence because of the special edition DVD, which was sort of the first iteration of the director's cut for The Abyss. In addition to doing video tap on that movie, I was given access to Jim's personal Ikegami camera, which recorded to portable 3/4 inch cassettes. The whole thing probably weighed, in my imagination, it weighed about 50 pounds. I'm sure it was lighter than that, but lugging it around the very humid South Carolina studio environment, I was instructed with trying to document things that were not getting documented by the official behind-the-scenes crew that had been hired by Fox, who, realistically came out for certain days. They have a budget, so they can only come out for certain times. I was there all the time anyway, so it made sense for me to try and capture a lot of what was being constructed, what was happening in terms of the actors learning how to dive, the subs, basically everything. There was nothing off the shelf from that movie, basically. So it was a fascinating time to be out of film school, be on a film set for the first time. It kind of ruined me because I thought most movies were made in abandoned nuclear reactors. When I went to my second show, it was really just sort of, what is this? Is this a soundstage? What's that? So I documented a lot of what was happening there, and videotape stuff directly off of the ROV feeds. So there was just a library of material that I knew existed. And when they started doing the special edition director's cut for the DVD, I was given a budget. It was very low. I want to say $4,000, just a pittance to try and put together something special. And the other nice thing was they were bringing in almost all of the cast to do ADR work. I've heard different reasons for that. I think Fox might have had trouble locating some of the original sound elements, but I'm not sure if that's true. But they were there. They were upstairs recording their ADR, and when they were done, they came downstairs to me for an interview. So it was the best of all possible worlds. They just had their memories refreshed about what it was like to make this film and what it was like to work on it. They got to see footage and just sort of refresh the memories. And because I'd been there on set, I think a lot of them opened up in a way that they normally wouldn't have. I won't claim by any stretch of the imagination that I was close to Ed Harris, but we did manage to share at least a couple of beers at a party one night. He knew who I was. And so when he finally sort of told his stories about what I think he would agree was one of the hardest things he's ever done, I think he opened up in a way that I don't think he would have to anyone else. And I think it really sort of became the heart of the documentary, was looking at this production through the actors' eyes, more so than Jim's or the other filmmakers. I think it really was, this is how the actors experienced the abyss. And so I let them sort of take the lead and tell the stories. And I did the best I could to construct the narrative around their experiences and their best stories. And they have them. They have them. I'm very proud of that work. And I think the fact that people still watch it is fantastic. Now, I had exactly 59 minutes, 59 seconds, and 23 frames, or whatever the limit of what you could put on that side of the DVD. So I had a cut that was longer. Maybe someday there will be a special edition that can include more. But I was very happy with that work.
Well, that is interesting to hear, because the 4K was just released, so there was no talk of, hey, let's have Ed's kind of extended cut of this.
No, and honestly, it's a situation where going that deep into the archive introduces new troubles, because 3/4 U-matic was not the best archive medium, and that's what most of my material was shot on. And so finding the machines that can recover that, getting it digitized, getting access to it, getting back to the original materials, I don't think anyone had the time or the patience really to make that happen. So let's treat it as a record of the time. That documentary was made roughly, I want to say, 4 years after the original release, maybe 3, I forget. And so it's very close to the event, and I think therefore it's the most accurate. There have stories have surfaced since then that I think are partial exaggerations. I'm not going to call out anybody on it, but I'd like to think I remembered what happened, and I have the documentary partially to prove it. So we're going to stick with that.
Yeah, and something I took away from what you said is the fact that Fox had hired some other team to document it, similarly to how you were doing it, but you were doing your own thing for everything that they were missing. I think that that's really interesting, and I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, at the time, Fox behind the scenes, I got to give real credit to. Sorry, I should silence that. That won't happen often, I promise.
Oh, you're good.
Bill Russ is an amazing director. He's done a tremendous amount of work for Fox and other studios. Last time I caught up with him, he was at Paramount, and he was a really good director. And when he came out with his film crew, he captured a lot. He did get key moments, and I used those in my documentary. But it was just a fact that this was before DVDs were really a known thing when The Abyss was shot. And so the idea of having the level of coverage that you have seen for films like Lord of the Rings, where essentially you have a documentarian dedicated to the show for the run of the show to go deep in multiple areas, just wasn't something that had been contemplated yet. And so, I think that's something that Van has also really capitalized on. He knows that fans really enjoy the deep dive into how these films are made, and has taken advantage of many archives to do that level of deep work. And he told me, I don't know if it's true, that Peter Jackson was very happy with the Abyss documentary, and he sort of liked the fact that it went as deep as it did, and it sort of became a template for a lot of his own behind the scenes efforts. I'd like to think. I don't know if that's completely true, but at least he's seen it and he liked it. So
Right. That's
yeah.
that's very cool. And yeah, I've always been of the mindset, and this is something that's, just recently within the last couple of years really struck me, is I always thought, like, behind the scenes documentaries, stuff like that, stuff you find on releases. I never actually thought that people like yourself were really diehard kind of working on it as a, like, I assumed it was more along the line of what you were saying, like, Fox or whatever the studio is just, kind of assembles it really quickly and, and tosses it. But you're kind of in a league of your own in terms of that stuff.
That model still exists, I guarantee it.
Right.
But I think the studios have seen the value of having a deep archive of how a film was made. And it's something that I definitely approached on Terminator 2 when, I approached Jim along with Dave Hudson, who is a friend of Jim's and had worked on films before The Abyss. I think he worked on Oh goodness, he might have even worked on. Yes, he worked on Xenogenesis. That's how far back Dave goes.
Wow.
And so he sort of paired us together. And the whole premise was we're going to shoot much more than would have been shot by an outside company. And also, he would have total control over that footage. And so it just allows us to have a much freer access on set. It allows us to get a much broader picture of what it took to make the film. If we're doing our job right, we're interviewing every department head at least once, and if we're not interviewing them, we're watching them do their work. We made several trips to the Stan Winston studio as things developed. We took trips up to ILM to watch the CGI develop. I couldn't make it to Cyber Scan, which was a company in Northern California, but Van took a camera and made sure. Oh wait, no, I did on Terminator 2. On The Abyss, Van went by himself for when Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio and Ed Harris were scanned for their head that was then emulated by the water tentacle. So we had that footage. But for the next trip, I made sure that we were there when Robert Patrick was digitized for the T-1000, because we knew that it was going to be interesting to people. And so we wanted to make sure that that was covered. And it's kind of fun to go to the Academy Museum now and go to the visual effects exhibit, and I can turn to my wife or my son and I can say, I shot that. It's kind of fun.
That's so cool. So when you watch The Abyss, have you seen it recently? I know it just had a theatrical re-release in December.
I missed the theatrical re-release, but I did get the 4K, and we had a screening at home. My family does this thing we call OK Stop, where anyone can shout OK Stop and the film's pause, and they can ask questions about what I did or what was going on. Sometimes I have good answers, sometimes I don't have answers, and sometimes I stop the film to tell them a story that might not be obvious. And, like, hey, see this scene where they're going into the sub? You're about to see Jim Cameron's brother. He had a live crab in his mouth. That's not fake. So I can tell these stories, and it's kind of fun. So they enjoy watching it that way.
So it's like a live audio commentary kind of thing going on.
Mm-hmm.
So when you watch The Abyss overall, having you're in a very interesting position where you're associated with the film, but you really didn't have much or anything to do with it being made. So you can answer this question in terms of, do you think it holds up?
Yeah, no, I was involved
in it.
I was,
okay,
but in a slightly tangential role, doing the video tap. Obviously, I'm recording what the cameras see. I'm playing it back when they need to see it. But I also took on an editing role in the special edition of the film. There's a sequence when Ed Harris is down meeting with the non-terrestrial intelligences, where in the special edition, they show him what's happening at the surface, and you learn about the tidal wave that's approaching the coastline of every continent. And he asks why. So you see the news broadcast explaining that up. And when he asks why, the aliens answer with a video montage that became known as Man's Greatest Hits. And it was basically man's inhumanity to man, as represented by sometimes incredibly familiar iconography. Like we had footage from the concentration camps, we had footage of the A-bombs and the A-bomb tests, and then stuff that wasn't perhaps quite as graphically memorable, but was emotionally powerful. Like I don't remember exactly who this was, but it was like an 11-year-old fighter, right? So you see a kid with a gun just in a war scene from one of the Middle East conflicts, and I'm sorry, I don't remember which one. So you just have the worst imagery of human beings being bad to other human beings. And that was a quick cut montage, and it was meant to be relentless. And it's like, we don't trust you. We are aliens. We've seen what you can do. This is why we are doing this. You did this, you did this, you did this, you did this. Here is roughly 100 years of history. Anything that could have been videotaped or photographed. This is how you are. This is how you behave. This is why we are destroying your world.
Right.
And then it's purely because of Ed Harris's act of selflessness to go down to the bottom of the trench and defuse the bomb that they see there's hope for us. And so that montage and the atom bomb montage that precedes it was cut by me. And I have to tell you, I did that sort of on my own time on the weekends when the stages were closed, because I only had these 2 3/4 U-matic decks to edit with. It's not like I could take them home. They weighed 70 pounds. So I basically, had them power up a generator, and I would edit on the weekends. And I had the flu. It was cold. I'm lit by the sort of the red light of these propane flame heaters, and I'm just hating life watching the worst possible imagery, cutting this montage. And it was effective. And then it got transferred to 70 millimeter and used as rear projection plates on the surface of the water of the NTI chamber. And so that was my direct contribution to the film. I also ended up cutting the trailer for the film, and that was a request from Jim. He wasn't happy with what the studio was doing. In lack of a better way of describing it, each trailer that Fox came up with was essentially, look at this beautiful shot, and now this one, and now this one. And it just didn't have tension. So Jim basically directed me to say, you're good at montage, use that capability to create units of conflict, either visual or dialogue or whatever, and just make sure that if something's going left in the first shot, make sure it's countered by something going right in the other. It's almost the definition of Eisensteinian dialectic editing, right? And that became the basis for the trailer, and I was able to use a really lovely piece of music from the movie, the IMAX movie Chronos, which is a film about Western civilization as told through time lapse. I want to credit the writer of that music, and I think his name is Michael Stearns. I apologize for not being able to remember. It might be Michael Stern.
Okay.
So I'm going to say it two ways. You can edit it to make it great. Written by Michael Stern. Written by Michael Stearns. And hopefully one of those is correct.
All right.
And so it just sort of changed the nature of the trailer. And they ended up having a taste test at Fox, and marketing put together their presentation and showed their trailer, and then they showed mine, and they had a literally show of hands. Who likes A, who likes B? And according to Jim, I wasn't there. I was sleeping, having worked on it all night. Everyone raised their hands for the one that I had edited. So
wow.
So
you are more closely associated than I was under the assumption. Having said all of that, do you think the film itself, whether it's special edition, theatrical, holds up?
I think it does, and I think it's a rather amazing record of the time. I think the computer-generated effects, even though we have seen things even more amazing, absolutely fit into that realm and absolutely tell the story in a lovely way. I would argue that maybe the thing that has suffered the most is some of the dialogue and some of the assumptions. And I don't have a good example of this. I'm going to have to think of it. But when Hippie reveals that the character of Coffee has rescued one of the warheads from the sub and is rewiring it to be its own bomb, and it's called a multiple impact reentry vehicle. It's one of several warheads that are put on top of the missile. So a missile comes into the atmosphere, then can split into 9 or 15 different warheads. It becomes a much harder thing to stop. And this is in our nuclear arsenal. It's real. Jim researched it. So this is one nuclear warhead of, like, I believe 8 on top of the missile. And Hippie says, here's Merv. And the joke is meant to sort of imply, here's Merv Griffin. Like, it's the introduction to the Merv Griffin show. No one watching this as a young person is going to remember the Merv Griffin show in this day and age.
Right.
So that's a dated reference. And that's not the best example I can come up with, but that's one that sticks in my craw when I watch the film now.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. I don't know if that's worth it.
I'm kind of because I was very unfamiliar with The Abyss until the past December when I did check it out in theaters for the first time, and loved it immensely, as I love all of Cameron's films. But something that did strike me, and I'm curious if you feel the same, is when Ed Harris is slapping Mary Elizabeth to kind of revive her, and he's calling her a bitch. That sort of struck me. Like, I was like, where's this coming from? But I guess you have to kind of remember that that they've had a tumultuous relationship is essentially what's been established. And maybe that's why he calls her a bitch. It just struck me as like an odd choice of words to tell someone you're trying to save.
I think I can justify that entirely from the fact that he is trying to get her to fight back. And so he's using every tool in his arsenal to get her spirit to respond.
Okay.
It's like, how dare you call me a bitch? That's going to be yet another level of raising her hackle and forcing her to respond.
Okay.
So, and look, yes, it was a hard scene. It was a violent scene, but everything about it is trying to get her to come back to life. And
Right.
I don't consider that to be off the table, or I don't know what you would call it. I don't think it was abusive. I think it was absolutely justified by the experience. And had
Right.
he not succeeded, he would have felt awful for
Right.
having done that. But there was a method to what he was trying to do, and he was trying to reach her in a way that only, someone who he had a close relationship with could.
Right.
So
Right.
that didn't trigger for me, and I don't remember my kids having any response to that either.
Interesting. Yeah, and maybe it was written that way so that it would sort of, for different audience members, stick with them and make them, because it's not just, Cameron didn't want, just a traditional attempt at revival. So let's make this a little more interesting here. Let's,
Yeah.
throw in some choice words, and maybe that'll stick with people and make them wonder why that was said. And hearing you justify it, it's sort of like, yeah,
Yeah.
that sort of makes sense now. Just in that moment, it was like, that's kind
Yeah.
of strange.
I'm remembering a couple of other instances. When we first see her, she basically telephones down, video phones down to Deep Core from the surface ship. And when Ed hangs up on her, we're with him when he says, "God, I hate that bitch." And then Hippie responds, "Well, you probably shouldn't have married her then, huh?" And so that's the first time the audience realizes that there is a deeper relationship here. Oh, wow, this is this is ex-husband and wife. And so the line is first uttered there. So that's almost a starting point. And then there are several little cues throughout the film where that relationship is rekindled. It happens as she is trying to win him to her side. She has seen the mantis ship and is convinced that this is not anything to be afraid of. It's beautiful and should be respected and possibly helped. And so she's using her passion to try and convince Bud to come to her side. And so that humanizes her and sort of reawakens, I think, in him an understanding of her spirit. And then there's another very delicate moment, which I always loved, and it was referenced in the script. And basically, it's before the water tentacle comes in, and you see them sleeping, and Bud Brigman is snoring. And Lindsay basically very casually says, "Bud, turn on your side," or something to that effect. And it's the kind of thing that if you've been married and you snore, I am an apnea survivor, you know that wives do. They poke you, or they wake you up just enough so that you change your position and you do it. And it's such an intimate little thing, and it just shows the mileage that they've logged together.
Right.
And I think I haven't read the script since I worked on the film, but I'm pretty sure that Jim even mentions it in there, just like ... a clue as to the many miles they've logged together or something like that. I'm not going to be able to quote it directly, but I just remember that's a beautiful little detail, and
Right.
that's part of it. And the Abyss does function as a love story and the rekindling of a love story because of that. And that was very, very carefully observed, and I think beautifully done.
Before we move on from the Abyss,
Mhm.
talking about you cutting the Mankind's or Man's greatest hit?
It was called Man's Greatest Hits,
Man's greatest hits.
but Mankind is probably a more appropriate term.
When you were cutting that, was Cameron anywhere around? Was he like hovering over your shoulder kind of thing, or was it all on you kind of thing?
I was given a pool of footage by Miller Drake, the visual effects editor, and said, "Try this. This is what we're going for." I'd read the scene in the script. We wouldn't shoot the scene that the footage is used for almost another, I'm going to say 6 months. It didn't happen until we came back to Los Angeles and we're shooting on a completely different stage. So there was plenty of time to get it right if I got it wrong. But I do remember when Jim saw it for the first time, he was happy, and it didn't change. Now, when it was edited into the film, obviously that montage had to be cut against Ed Harris's reaction. So the montage is not used by itself. Large sections of it are, and same with the atom bomb explosions. But it was cut into a larger narrative. So when Ed Harris is watching the bomb explosions, Joel Goodman, the editor, did a lot of fast cutting between Ed and the bombs until it just sort of became this overwhelming bit. And he says, "Okay, enough, I get it." And so my direct montage of that was changed when it was used within the film itself. But it survived essentially in its first draft.
Wow. Wow. And of course, when you think about what that was, 89, the film, but just a few years later for that particular cut that you're talking about, the special edition.
Mhm.
So just a few more years later, right? And it's crazy to think that, it's only gotten worse in terms of what could have been included had the film come out, I don't know, in like the mid 2000s, what you could have included in man's
Oh,
great, it's
oh, that sadly, that pile of footage isn't getting any smaller.
no, it's just, yeah, it's it could go on 10 minutes longer.
Yeah.
It very, very, very sad. I mean, literally just a couple days ago, you could have included something.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely
Absolutely.
insane.
Yeah.
So
I'd like to say that I'd like to hope that there are also some, like, if someone wanted man's best moments of man, that someone else could edit that montage.
right.
But that isn't what the story called for.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was again, being unfamiliar with what the Abyss, and it was the special edition that was re-released. So, walking out of that theater, I was like, wow, that essentially that was Cameron's The Day the Earth Stood Still, basically,
Mhm. Yeah,
for all intents
that
and
was his
purposes.
approach. But the popular wisdom at the time was that it was too long. And so they had to cut something, and it's easier to cut a whole subplot if you can.
Yeah.
And this was one that could be cut. Now you end up with some weak tea, in my opinion, because Ed Harris makes this big sacrifice to go that deep. We know he's not going to make it back. The aliens save him. He shows up and says, "How you guys doing?" And they essentially flash the message, "Hey, love your wife." And then all of a sudden he's rescued, and the aliens sort of end the story. So even though it was always a Deus ex machina, at least in the long form, you understood that it had been earned. Ed Harris had done something to change the fate. Now, you could ask some other niggly questions if you wanted to. It's like, these aliens had tremendous technology. Couldn't they have just neutralized that bomb themselves? We don't ask that question because we don't have that answer, and hopefully no one goes there. But I did have an idea, which I quite like, but I was told it was too dark. Imagine this, and you have to be familiar with the film for this to make sense. So if you don't want to share this with your listeners, edit here. Let's say Ed Harris doesn't succeed in reviving Lindsay, and everyone is absolutely crushed. And then out of nowhere, the water tentacle comes and takes her body away. It's gone. And now Ed Harris, having nothing to live for, still makes the choice, or Bud Brigman, I should say, the character. Bud Brigman still makes the choice to go that deep to defuse the bomb because it's what she would have wanted. We can't do this to these aliens. We have to prevent this from going off. The aliens come, they take him down to their world. In the chamber, you have the same story about the tidal wave. You have the same result of them saving us because of Ed Harris's act and the fact that he has exhibited love for his wife. But then, because these aliens have superior technology in every way, walking out of the water wall comes Lindsay, restored and alive. And together they get to celebrate as the aliens bring Deep Core to the surface, and the story ends.
Now, who told you that was too dark?
Everybody.
Everybody?
Everybody. Oh, you can't kill her there. No one's going to buy that. And the thing is, it's also armchair quarterbacking, because the idea comes after the scene is shot, after the film is shot. And so it's just like, where were you?
Right.
And so, no, and unfortunately, it's not fair. And I'm sure there are plenty of reasons why they wouldn't want to do it. But at the time when I proposed it, it was just, no, too dark. We can't do that.
No, I love that. Honestly, seriously, it's yeah, it would have made it much more. I don't know. I mean, the movie itself is interesting, and I am curious to see what the theatrical cut feels like when I get around to checking that out. I do have a feeling I will prefer the special edition, just for like you said, it kind of weakens. I like how you said it's a weak tea. But yeah, no, I love that idea. It's a shame that it was kind of turned down, but again, maybe that's sort of also the whole Cameron thing. He's so attached to his stuff, right?
Yeah.
His DNA is all throughout.
But he is not immune to good story, and I have a story that I can tell about Titanic in that regard.
Okay.
But before we tell that, can I just tell one tiny little anecdote about the Abyss?
Yeah, go ahead.
if you watch the special edition and you watch when the tidal wave is attacking the shorelines, pay attention to characters in the lower left. And this is something I did not catch until I watched it with my kids. There is a shot when the tidal wave is basically paused and is sitting there at the edge of the shoreline. And there's a gentleman in the foreground with shorts, and someone reaches in and pulls off his shorts. And that's in the plate. That was shot on the day. And I don't know if the visual effects editor saw it. I don't know if anyone ever saw it. But this is in the days of film where once you have committed millions of dollars to the roto and the mat work, etc., you're not going to get rid of that. And it's sort of a testament to how beautiful the imagery was that it didn't get noticed for, many years. So
Hey, I mean, if
there
I
you
had
go.
a giant tidal wave coming toward me, maybe I'd want to go out in a in a blaze of glory, pull my pants down.
Exactly. Well, it was someone else. Someone else was playing a practical joke on this actor.
Right. Yeah, maybe I'd
It's
pull
there
someone's pants
for the
down.
whole world to see.
Right.
So anyway, no, I was telling you about Jim is not immune to referencing listening to a story idea and incorporating it. And the story I have to tell you for this is from Titanic. And you will remember that the modern day story was all about the Bill Paxton character searching for the diamond, and the Gloria Stewart character, Old Rose, essentially had it with her the whole time. And at the end of the movie, we see her by herself going to the stern of the ship and throwing it into the water. All right. And it was a beautiful private moment between her and the audience. So it's like, we are with her. We know that she's honoring her love. We know that she's honoring everything about the experience and denying this capitalist his booty, right? Because we don't care about Bill Paxton's character. We are so ensconced in what Rose has done that we want to follow her story, and we want it to be an intimate moment that is just hers. That's not how it was shot. And I do believe this scene is available out in the world, so I don't think I'm telling any tales out of school. But originally, Bill Paxton or someone sees her approaching the stern of the ship, and they run and they stop her, and she's standing right there and says, don't come any closer, I'll drop it. And they have an exchange, and it's this whole big standoff. And she gets to say her piece about, you're searching for the wrong treasure. And she ends up casually tossing it over the side. And Bill Paxton is able to see it from her perspective and laugh it off. And so he is transformed by her story in a way that I think the audience was supposed to be, but it wasn't working. It was a bridge too far. Poor Bill Paxton talked about how he had to just sort of suddenly change gears and laugh it off. And it wasn't working. And Steve Quayle, the second unit director, at one of the screenings for crew before the film came out, Steve's definitely a trusted member of the crew, and he was there, and he told Jim point blank, this would be better if Old Rose dropped the diamond without anyone knowing. And I wasn't there, but shortly after that, they were scheduling a reshoot, and they brought back Gloria Stewart. They recreated the stern of the Keldysh, the ship we shot on, and they shot what they needed to do to make that the story point.
Wow.
And so that's Jim being responsive. Hang on.
I was just about to say that there's also something making like a.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm on my laptop and I am at work, and
you're
I'm
good.
trying to figure out how to make everything private, which I'm bad at. Let's see here. I think if I turn on focus, do not disturb, hopefully that does it.
All right. But no, that is I know exactly what you're talking about. That's I think it's called the alternate ending on the DVD and Blu-ray. And it is, I mean, it's fun to watch, but that film, Titanic is definitely my favorite Cameron film. That film is so ingrained in my head, and seeing that, which Steve and everyone kind of realized that Bill, like the camera literally is like above him, and then it kind of pulls back as he's laughing into the skies kind of thing. And it's such a weird twist. It feels it to me, it's just not even justified. The flip there, it's so out of nowhere. And I've seen the movie so many times that when I saw that, I was like, wow, this is like, I can't imagine that this is almost how this film ended in a way. I love much more the subtlety of just old Rose. And I argue that that's one of the best plot twists in all of film history. Like, the fact that she's had that with her the whole time. And we're led to believe, like Brock, that it went down with the ship. And here it is, you know? So, yeah, I much prefer the way that it was. And so, but to your point, that came from someone
It came
else.
from another crew member, and Jim recognized a better idea and immediately incorporated it.
So
You
he's
know?
not immune to suggestions when it comes to if it can better the story. So
Yeah.
interesting. Before we get into like talking about your stuff on Titanic, Terminator 2 comes out just a couple years after The Abyss. Were you also suggested because Van was on there? Is that sort of like how that worked? You were just brought over because Van was on?
Well, I think especially getting together with Dave Hudson, the idea of being a dedicated behind-the-scenes crew. I didn't do video tap on that. Essentially, I switched to pure documentarian roles on that.
Gotcha.
So I was definitely watching other kids play, if you, in lack of a better term. I was shooting behind the scenes for the show. I will say my thumb is actually in The Abyss, and my back is in Terminator 2 when Linda Hamilton is being interviewed, the psych interview at the beginning of the film. When they first cut behind the mirror, you'll see a slightly chunky gentleman at the camera. That's my back. And then finally in Titanic, I got a close-up with my camera as they open the safe. So you can see me in at least 3 James Cameron films, if you're curious.
Wow.
So for Terminator 2, it was very much the situation where we were, I was hired to do behind the scenes and basically just create an archive and follow the show. And that ended up being a very publicity-based behind the scenes, making a video for Terminator 2. It doesn't have the depth. Yeah, it does not have the depth of The Abyss. It was very much a product of publicity. And that became sort of the disappointing thing for a lot of what I did, because people weren't interested in the deep dive. At least they weren't willing to put it out before the film came out. And by the time there was time for sort of a retrospective, a lot of people just weren't interested. So I did this for other films as well. I did it for a lot of the Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin films. I am sorry, I don't know how to silence that. I'm on it. And it was just, it really did become watching other kids play. And I much prefer working on films proper and not working on films about films. And so that's been my focus for many years now.
Yeah, because there was a new, I guess, retrospective on the 4K for T2 back in 2017, whenever that came out. You had no association with that whatsoever?
They used the footage. And the footage was basically shot by myself, Dave Hudson, and Anders Falk. That was sort of the 3-man unit that did all the behind the scenes for Terminator 2. I didn't work on True Lies. I did cut some trailers for True Lies, but I was otherwise engaged at that time. And Anders Falk and Dave Hudson did that one. And then it was myself and Anders Falk for Titanic. I'm sorry, I forgot your question.
No. I was just asking if you were involved directly with that new retrospective on the 4K for T2.
No. Van was, I believe. And Van is amazing. Van absolutely respects fans and wants to create as deep of an archive as possible. He wants every possible question to be answered by the documents that he puts on these projects that people can then watch and enjoy. So he's trying very hard to give everyone a free film school experience that helps them appreciate what it took to make the film, what it was like to be there, and how all of this relates to story, which is really the goal. Is like, why were these choices made? It was to help the story, and here's how it helps the story, or how it doesn't hurt the story because we had to put a Band-Aid on it, So
interesting. Being in the Abyss and Terminator 2 and Titanic, are you at the end of the credits? No, you're not in there.
No. This was all uncredited.
Okay.
I happened to be there, and it was fine. Like, no one's going to put a credit on screen for Ed Harris thumb double.
Ed Harris thumb stunt double.
Yeah, exactly.
Just a few years after T2 is T2 3D, which if you're, I don't know if it's a Universal Studios attraction.
Yeah, I didn't have anything to do with that, but you should probably try and talk to John Bruno if you haven't, because that was very much his bailiwick.
Right.
I might be able to put you in touch if you want.
Absolutely, please. Yes, because there is a beautiful on one of the DVDs for Terminator 2. There's a beautiful making of T2 3D. I think it's called Breaking the Screen Barrier.
Okay.
I mean, it's very cool because that is such a like I've done 2 roundtables already with different people associated with not John, but
Mhm.
other different people. I'm trying to get Adam Bizarre who worked on it, and all these people, Jeff Don, who was the
Mhm.
makeup artist on there. And but I love T2 3D. It's such a special part of Cameron's filmography because it's not a traditional film. It's
Yeah.
a Universal Studios attraction that, you know, it's so weird that they were able to even get Jim on board for something like that, which was pretty, to my understanding, revolutionary at the time, having the director of the movies come on to the theme park attraction.
Mhm.
And then right before, so he does that, and then he goes right into Titanic, which is absolutely just mind blowing to think about. But no, I would love to talk to John. Absolutely, he's to my understanding, he's also because he's worked on what Deep Sea Challenge with Jim.
Yeah, I guess he was part of Deep Sea Challenge. I wasn't part of Deep Sea Challenge, but John Bruno's been there since near the beginning. He won an Academy Award for The Abyss, and he was involved in T2. He's the janitor who deals with the Harrier jet in True Lies. That's one of his cameos.
That's so cool.
Um, but he's been a long term member of Cameron's film crew. So
And that is something I love. If you look at even because I mean the obvious one is the cast. You see time and time again people, Michael Biehn, Jeanette Goldstein, Arnold Schwarzenegger, constantly, you know,
mhm,
in multiple Cameron films. He likes working with the same people if he can.
mhm.
And to your point, even the people behind the scenes, you'll see carry through a lot of his films. And I love that, you know, whether that's I don't know, to me it's dedication. To me it's respect for the people you work with, and hey, we had a good time making this, do you want to see if we'll have a good time making this kind of thing? Would you say that that's what that is, the
Yeah, I would look. It's interesting. I mean, I I had a decent relationship with Bill Paxton, and he was definitely a fan of Jim's, and he knew Jim way back from like art direction days in the Corman films. So that relationship was forged in fire before Bill became an actor. Um, and I think Bill had a really good understanding of Jim and trust that if you were in a Jim Cameron film as an actor, you were not going to be embarrassed by whatever he did. He was going to get and photograph or assemble a good performance, one that audiences were going to respond to. If you were the villain, they were going to hate you. If you were the hero, they were going to be with you. I do think that during the making, that can be tested. And I think part of the Abyss documentary focuses on that. And Jim has a very good way of talking about it. It's like they were in a hard situation, and he was, and I'm quoting him here, the architect of their misery. And I think that that's a good way to put it, because when you're in the middle of a 6-month slog, 4-month slog, 3-month slog, I don't want to exaggerate. Everyone had different levels of slog. And every day you are having to answer to this. And perfectionist isn't really the right term, but someone who is trying very hard to keep all the elements moving to capture something that hasn't been captured yet. Sometimes that can wear on an individual who hasn't been tasked that way. And I think that was true for a lot of the cast of Titanic as well, many of whom had never been on an action film. They'd done plenty of films. We had a whole number of actors who really couldn't point to an action scene in their resumes, but they were hired because they were very good at playing characters of the era. And wait, now we have to be on a sinking ship. We have to get in and out of lifeboats that are sinking. We have to work at 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, trying to get these shots before the sun's up. And so they weren't particularly happy. Um, and they can take that out on Jim, but it's not really fair. And then usually what happens, and I think that this is true for almost everyone who works with a Jim, you'll have your doubts on the day. You might have your doubts for the whole show, but when you start to see it assembled and when you start to see it come together, you realize that there was a vision at work the whole time. And that vision might have changed, but it's still going to be a solid audience focused vision. And I really think that that is the key. He never forgets the audience. And if actors have to suffer a little bit of discomfort to get there, okay.
Everyone lives.
Yeah, I mean, look, Jim has a reputation for being tough. There's a T-shirt from Titanic, and there's the quote, James Cameron is a real hands-on director, and I have the bruises to prove it. And it's not fair, but it's funny and it's earned. And I think part of the reason why Jim has this reputation is when he expresses displeasure, he's very creative and memorable in how it's expressed. So when he has a reaction, it's worth sharing. It's not just a director having a small snit, which I've witnessed and is completely forgettable and you just sort of get over it. But he usually has a memorable quote or something that comes out of it that just keeps that character alive in the popular imagination. The one I can remember now, and I think it was from Terminator 2, is he just casually, he was just giving shit to one of the lighting crew. And he said the phrase, having X is like losing two good crew members, which is a very clever phrase and delivered at the right time in the right way is sort of devastating. And, essentially, I think it was a lighthearted jab and ultimately no one was hurt, but it's memorable. And I
Right.
think that's true of most of his, when he has his tirades and he's not alone. I think that's one of the reasons why they stand out because he's just very creative with them.
My new favorite one, which I just recently learned from a brilliant new documentary about aliens, it's called Aliens Expanded.
Okay.
It's nearly 5 hours long, and they did retrospective interviews with everybody, including Cameron. And they talked about the incident on Aliens known as the Tea Cart incident,
Okay.
because Aliens was filmed over in the UK.
Mhm.
And at that time, Cameron wasn't really known as who he is today. And all the people were very hesitant. The crew members were very hesitant to, who is this Cameron guy?
Mhm.
And they were accustomed to, before shooting, they would have somebody come on set and bring tea and little cookies and stuff like this, so that they could enjoy. And then
Mhm.
they would get to work. And I think Cameron recalls it as he was so frustrated that he walked over to the cart and he asked, "How much for this?" And she said the price, and he said, "Okay, now how much for all of it?" And she said, "Okay, here's the price." He whips out cash, pays for it. He says, "All right, we're good." And she says, "Yeah, we're good." And he says, "Okay, can you move over to the side real quick?" And he kicks the cart down the like whatever the hallway or whatever it is,
Mhm.
and he turns around and he basically lays it on the line. All right, look, no more tea, no more none of this stuff. Like, we're making a movie here. You don't like it, I'm out of here, kind of thing. And
Mhm.
oh man, that was because I had heard bits and bobs of that story, but I had never heard Cameron himself tell that story.
Right.
And I just thought that was absolutely brilliant. How much for this, and now how much for the whole thing? And he just kicks it right down the thing.
That sounds completely within character.
Gosh, it's so good. But when you look at your your filmography, we'll say, because you are a director, right? You would say you're a director, right?
I have directed. I have not directed anything in the feature realm. I've basically directed specific, basically behind the scenes focused documentaries.
Okay.
I've been close a couple of times on some animated projects.
Chicken
And,
Run.
well, yeah, that was behind the scenes, but I directed on that one. Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool.
But I mean,
Um,
Nick Park and Peter Lorre directed Chicken Run. Don't confuse the two.
right, right. But when you look at your filmography, the thing that does stand out the most is you have two Titanic pieces. One that you worked on for two of the Blu-ray releases, right? That is essentially what they were for.
Yeah, this gets a little complicated. I did the behind the scenes for the original Titanic, and I definitely worked very hard to create a deep archive. I interviewed everybody. And then around the time of the first special edition, which I want to say was around 2004, 2005, I was hired by Fox to try and do a long form documentary, sort of in the spirit of Under Pressure, Making the Abyss, right? So ended up re interviewing most of the cast, several of the crew, But ultimately, that project didn't come together as is. But all the pieces existed. And I'm very happy to say that Van was able to use them for a deep bench of what got created. And, you know, Oliver Shalom, John Landau, who just passed away, also heralded this material and used it in multiple formats to tell stories that I think were absolutely worth telling, even though I wasn't capable of finishing the piece that I thought would have been worth making.
Gotcha. Okay. So is that why you have the credit on what is it? Reflections on Titanic? Is that why you have that?
Well, I don't know if I'm listed as director. That's a surprise to me. That's not a credit I've claimed for myself. I definitely
Interesting.
directed all of the interviews. I definitely shot most of the behind the scenes.
Huh.
So obviously this is it's a bit of a palimpsest because a new project comes along. They're going to re-interview the cast. That will be new material that I had nothing to do with. And so then it will be a combination of things that I created. If they use older interviews, those are interviews that I marshaled, that I directed, and to the extent that you can direct an interview. I mean, you know what this is like. You don't know what you're going to get, but you are trying to steer people towards certain stories and certain moments, and then you're going to pick the best bits. So that's editing, that's writing. Is it directing? Limitedly, yes. But my specific story that I wanted to tell of the through line for Titanic, it didn't really come to fruition. And I'm okay with that because I think the stories that have made it out are just as fascinating and probably even more interesting to audiences. So,
Interesting. Yeah, for Reflections on Titanic, at least, it's directed by Ed W. Marsh, and this is on Letterboxd, which sources from the movie database online. And then if you go to the newest one on the 4K, Stories from the Heart, it's yourself credited and Thomas C. Grain.
Tom Grain, who is a executive at Fox, who also did a lot of behind the scenes. So it makes sense that he got involved in whatever he did for that. I'm sure it was fantastic.
Interesting. Okay.
So,
And then the final thing, and this is something that I'm very curious about because I don't even know what a creative producer is on Ghosts of the Abyss. What is a creative producer?
the joke is that a creative producer is a producer who doesn't have to care about money.
Well, there you go.
Okay. Uh, the Ghost of the Abyss is interesting because Jim had finished Titanic and was very interested in doing essentially a full-on series about the ocean, and it was called Ocean Challenge. And this was when he had just sort of invented his 3D camera system. And so he was hoping to create a pool of footage that could be used for multiple projects. Like the 3D footage could be used to make an IMAX special about rediving the wreck of Titanic with a focus on going places that his cameras couldn't originally go, with special remote operated vehicles that had been designed by his brother that could use fiber optics, which makes it just much more agile. You can get deeper into the wreck than when you have to carry a giant power line. And so Ghosts of the Abyss was one aspect of a larger plan. And we were working with Jean-Michel Cousteau. I think ABC was interested in doing it at the time, but then ultimately things just sort of fell apart. And the only thing to survive was the deal to make Ghosts of the Abyss for Walden Entertainment. So I was part of the crew that was putting together the TV show and, you know, that documentary. And so I was a producer on that to basically try and come up with how that was going to be essentially an editor who was going to help create stories ex post facto from the footage that was shot. And so Ghosts of the Abyss was the product that survived. And someone who I quite admire is the documentary filmmaker Al Reinert. He's no longer with us, but he directed a documentary which I can't recommend enough called For All Mankind. It's become harder to find now that you have the Apple series that shares that same name. But look hard. He put together an amazing documentary about the Apollo missions. He essentially took the entire Apollo library from even as early as I think the earliest footage he used was Gemini, but he might have gone even before that into Mercury. But he essentially made one poetic journey to the moon. And the only voices you hear are the personal recollections of the astronauts or the ground crew. You never hear a narrator. And he had this ability. He was a journalist first and foremost, and he had the ability to just sit down with these people and get them telling stories. He was a Texan by birth, and he knew a way to get these good old boys to sit down and tell their stories from a very personal perspective, and he used that as the basis for his documentary. And then, of course, it was wrapped in a beautiful score by Brian Eno. It's an amazing piece of film. I can't recommend For All Mankind enough. And Jim didn't necessarily have a plan for when he was doing this documentary. He knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to go back to Titanic, and he wanted to try and shoot very specific things. Can we get into this space? Can we get into this space? And let's just experience it. And he brought Bill Paxton along as essentially the everyman to be the audience surrogate so that we could experience it through him. And then he brought people who had become dear friends from Titanic, Ken Marshall and Don Lynch, the Titanic historians. He brought his friend Charlie Pellegrino, who has written about the Titanic. He brought a rust expert who had studied the biology of these extremophiles that eat steel, that are slowly consuming the Titanic. And so we had this cast of characters at sea with us, but there wasn't a story. And so it sort of became the job after the fact to interview these individuals and get their personal perspective on what happened and put the narrative together from that. And so there is no narrator in Ghosts of the Abyss. The story that's told is from the footage itself and from those interviews which I conducted after the mission. And so I creatively produced, along with other people, what that experience was going to be like. And then, that doesn't mean Jim didn't have a hand. He obviously helped shape it. He cut sequences himself. But I conducted the interviews and sort of created the first bed that became how that film was experienced.
Something I am curious about with Ghosts of the Abyss, because again, this was a pretty recent watch for me, and this one and Aliens of the Deep are still pretty unfamiliar to me. I've seen Ghosts of the Abyss once, but there are moments that strike me as maybe this was I don't know, post-production kind of trickery going on. The shots outside the submersible of looking at Bill Paxton looking out at the Titanic. Was that are you aware? Was that real footage, or was that like a camera trick kind of thing going on there?
It wasn't a camera trick. It was a reenactment of real events. So
Okay. Yeah.
when the subs were diving, we had, I think, a maximum of 3 little lipstick cameras stuck to suction cups around the inside of the sub. So we had live video that ran basically for the totality of some of the dives. The longest dive, I think, was 14 hours. And so we have video footage from inside for the entirety of those dives to the Titanic. Okay. And you see a lot of that in the film, usually used as a little window and like in a larger image. So it's like picture in picture to show video, because we didn't really want to blow standard def video up to IMAX. We did. It didn't always work. But so that was the ground truth. Okay. And then we staged it on the ship. We tinted the submersible and we shot it from the outside. We put smoke so that we could sort of recreate dry for wet, so that we could have IMAX quality visuals. So you could actually see the face of Bill Paxton or someone else looking out of the sub. Okay. And basically reenacting their reaction to what they had seen.
Okay.
Was artistic license taken? Yes. And Jim directed that. Was it not true? You tell me. You've seen a million documentaries, and I guarantee you've seen more reenactment than you think you have. But the goal was we weren't trying to recreate. We weren't trying to create something that hadn't happened. We were definitely shooting representations of what had happened, and that's true for Aliens of the Deep as well. And that was done while we were still at sea. So it's not like we assembled our narrative and said, "Oh, we need this beat. All right, well, let's get the sub and let's get the person and let's go do this." No, it was all shot at the same time. There was no post for that. What was post for Ghosts of the Abyss was we wanted the ghosts. And so we went through our footage and we figured out the beats that we wanted to do. And then we shot sort of the modern day people, or not the modern day people, the Molly Brown and the other characters. We shot the Marconi room operators, and we shot those people and we superimposed them over the footage. And that was an interesting little trick because we had to do basically on-set temp compositing in stereo so that we could make sure that it was going to work. And it worked. It was very much a rubber band and shoestring affair using technology that wasn't meant to be that way, but it got it done. So we could see our comps on set. We could sort of know that this was going to work, and then we went away and did them for real. I don't know how technical you want to get. You can end up in a sea of jargon on James Cameron films. For example, this sentence would have made sense to pretty much anyone working on The Abyss. We need an HMI on the DPV for the NTI POV ASAP.
Okay, I know that last part. I know that last part.
All right. So an HMI is a type of light, right? So we need an HMI on the DPV, which is the diver propulsion vehicle, which was designed by Mike Cameron, and it was a way that you could move the camera quickly underwater. It was like an underwater scooter, right? So we need an HMI on the DPV for the NTI POV. NTI was the term for the aliens, the non-terrestrial intelligence. So NTI, that's what that meant, and anyone on The Abyss would know that. And POV is point of view, and then ASAP, of course, is as soon as possible. So we need an HMI on the DPV for the NTI POV ASAP. Would make sense. For a very brief period of time in history, everyone knew what that meant, at least everyone on set. And so on any Cameron film, you can end up in similar sort of alphabet soup, depending on what you're doing. For Ghosts of the Abyss, Vince Pace had built these 3D camera rigs, which were fascinating. But perhaps the most fascinating one was the one that had to go inside the pressure housing that was mounted outside the submersible itself. When you're diving that deep, an air bubble is your enemy, because any weakness that causes that to implode is an explosion right next to a crew sphere, which might also not like having an explosion next to it. It might create enough of an imbalance that its very carefully handled, incredibly tense pressure situation could be compromised. So if you had a camera implode at that depth, that close to the crew sphere, you could lose the sub. I mean, everyone is aware of what happened to the submersibles last summer, right? But we're working with steel, we're working with things, and the engineering of our stuff was completely beyond the tolerances of what they were taking casually. So no one was particularly afraid of that, but we still had to get signals passing through that pressure vessel into the submersible so that we could record it, because these cameras couldn't have tape decks. How would you change the deck at depth, right? This is essentially a video technology, an HD video technology. And the technology for getting signals in and out of subs, that's been worked out. But the problem is it's a very complex system, and there was a tremendous amount of noise in the footage, right? Electronic noise. And we tried very hard to figure out where it was coming from. And ultimately, we lived with it. We minimized it as best we could, but we just lived with it and then cleaned it up in post. But one of the things that was sacrificed, this is probably too technical. I'll finish this very quickly.
This is great. This is great.
Okay. At the time, there was no portable HD deck that could record 24 frames per second. Okay? It was 30 frames per second. They just hadn't thought about the film market yet. So even though you had a camera that could shoot at 24 frames per second, there was a very special bit of machinery that essentially hashed up that signal onto passing through electronic cards so that it could be recorded in segmented form onto 30 frame per second videotape. Okay? And then we had another set of cards that could reverse that signal and return it to 24 frame per second material, because that's the language of film at this point. You know, Jim has shot high frame rate. That's a whole other issue. We were just trying to do film at this point. But we had to rip all that out in an attempt to simplify the signal path. So we could only shoot, after the first dive, we could only shoot at 30 frames per second. And so, you know, we ended up slowing everything down a little bit so that we could basically make that rate work. And it actually helped with the footage. But just making that happen in the middle of the North Atlantic when you're essentially 2 days from shore at your best, highest speed, it's just like, okay, we're going to make this work. And now we're sailing and now we're out. And oh shit, we've got noise. Let's tear everything apart and stay up all night and see if we can make it work and then button it up in time in the morning to dive. It was a real challenge. And then in the middle of that, we had a hurricane. And in the middle of that, we had 9/11. So
And
that was,
that's
yeah,
sorry, sorry. And that is something which maybe it might be in the extended version. I only watched the theatrical cut of Ghost of the Abyss.
okay.
Like with all Cameron films, there's at least 2 different cuts, except for Titanic, as far as I know, and Terminator. But uh, that is, and you would know this better than anyone. That was a creative decision that I was very interested in because that is, I guess, not the plot twist, but it is a twist, or like an insane revelation when you realize that all the while they were at the bottom, this was happening up on top,
Mhm.
and there is no cut to any of the footage that we've all seen that's ingrained in our head. Was that a creative choice? And like we're not cutting to a plane going into the tower, kind of thing.
The thing is, we really didn't have access to that imagery. We had an internet link, but it was weak. And so we were spared in the middle of the North Atlantic. We were spared the endless replay of the planes crashing into the World Trade Centers. So it was almost larger in our imagination than it was having seen it. I remember when we were back on shore, like the first year anniversary, when they started showing the documentaries, and I saw that footage almost for the first time. It floored me because by the time we got back, there was sort of an informal moratorium on showing it. I don't know if you remember this, but like the news just sort of stopped showing it because it just felt exploitive, right? We were in a period of mourning and we just didn't want to watch that continual reign of death. So while it wasn't censored and it wasn't whitewashed, it just wasn't shown. So we didn't think to use it in our presentation because that wasn't our experience. We heard about it, but we really didn't see it. And we were sort of at the end of what BBC shortwave could tell us about what was happening on shore. I was in mission control and I was on what's called the BFA, which is a polite term for, can I say this can I swear on your podcast?
Go right ahead.
That was the polite term for the big fucking antenna. Okay. Because I was down in mission control, I was where all the imagery was coming. And so I needed to communicate to the camera crews. And so I had a radio mic with a giant antenna that could speak to the entire boat wherever anyone was. I could say what I needed to say about, hey, camera, left eye's soft, or we need to reload, or whatever. So I could communicate with camera crews. And so I'm in mission control when I get this little feed on the internet that this has happened. And they just launched the subs. And so I go on the air and I announce it. And within a minute, Charlie Pellegrino comes running down the stairs because his wife worked at the World Trade Centers. Turns out she wasn't there that day. She was fine, but he was like distraught. And the news spread very quickly. And they tried to tell Jim on the way down, but communication's very rough. It's basically an ultra high frequency transponder that then gets pitch shifted back. As I understand it, gets pitch shifted back into what you can hear inside the sub. And Bill Paxton tried to tell him what was going on, but we have the videotapes from inside the sub. And so we hear what Jim and the other people in the sub, I think it was Don Lynch and Anatoly Sagalevich, I think was the pilot that day. And we hear what they hear, and it's, World Trade Center bombing. The amazing thing is, Jim hears enough that he starts to sort of put together, and without having heard or having known at the time, I mean, I don't know how many people were aware of Osama bin Laden before 9/11, but Jim was. He said, I wonder if it was bin Laden. And he was aware enough of the situation that he was able to just pluck that name out of the ether, as far as I'm concerned, and sort of was able to put it together in his own head as to what had happened. They were on a very specific mission that day to try and rescue one of the submersibles, or excuse me, one of the ROVs that had died inside the ship. And so it was a complex engineering operation to try and hook it with the other ROV and then push it out one of the other entrances so that they could rescue it. And it was a success. And so they come up and they're totally happy. And then it's like, hey, congratulations, but we have something to tell you. And by this point, it had sunk into the entire crew. And so it was a real contrast. And the thing is, it was absolutely fair game for what we were doing, because it's very easy to say that that was what the Titanic story was in its day. Roughly the same number of people, obviously completely different motivations. But it was just like, okay, this is devastating news, and we can now understand firsthand what that might have felt like in 1912,
Right.
because we've now experienced it for ourselves. And I think it affected everybody, because it's just like, here we are in the middle of the North Atlantic. We're making this documentary. We're miles and miles from shore. And everyone's cut off from home, and it's only limited communication. Like, we can fax. I don't remember if we had sat phones at this time or not. I don't think we did. So we could send faxes back home. We could communicate to people very badly through a very limited internet connection, satellite internet that only works sometimes. And I just remember just thinking how horrible this all is. And I do have one slightly funny story, which I think I can tell in retrospect. We did decide, after a period of time, to go back to our home base. And I'm trying to remember where it was. It wasn't Halifax. We were shooting out of St. John's. Okay. And it's the middle of the night. I'm down there transferring tapes, because that's part of what you do when you're working on a documentary that doesn't have enough crew members and you're on a Russian ship. You back everything up, and you back it up in real time overnight, because that's how it was at the time. And this very official voice comes over the big fucking antenna and says, Academic Caldish, please state your destination. And it was clearly, at least I think, maybe I was being spoofed by someone else, but it was very clearly like a government asking us our thing. And no one responded, or if they responded, I couldn't hear it, because it might have been something that they were broadcasting on all frequencies, and then the bridge maybe responded. But they asked again. They asked 3 times. And I very casually, after a moment, I picked up the microphone and I said, I'm not driving, but we're headed for St. John's. And didn't hear from them again. So maybe there was a helicopter with a missile aimed at our ship, and that was enough to satisfy them. Who knows?
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that is talking about rescuing that piece that was lost in the Titanic. That is definitely probably the most gripping part of the whole thing, at least in my opinion.
Mhm.
And then there was part of me that wondered if that was also did that actually genuinely happen, or was that
Yes.
created for suspense,
No,
kind of thing?
we lost a vehicle.
Wow.
Pressure makes everything hard. You could argue space is easier than deep ocean, just because vacuum is the absence of one atmosphere. Okay. The deep ocean is like 800 atmospheres. So it's like everything being pressed. I've heard it described, and perhaps this is hyperbolic, but imagine the entire weight of the Empire State Building pressing down on your head, but from every direction. Right. Okay. So it just becomes much harder, and you have these vessels that are built to sort of handle it. And Mike Cameron's ROVs were brilliant, because he basically put all of his electronics inside oil so that they were able to take the pressure, because water itself doesn't compress much further than it can compress, and oil as well. But water obviously causes conduction problems. Oil doesn't conduct, so you can have electronics. You can make this work. But the battery was a weak spot, because the battery, from memory, couldn't get wet, but it's still under all that pressure. So you have these very tightly packed anodes and diodes that have thin layers protecting them from touching each other. But under pressure, those can fail. And then you have a thermal runaway, because of all that stored energy is now being released. And if that were to happen at the surface, it would be a small bomb. Okay. But at the bottom of the ocean, you are witnessing essentially bubbling. But the fact that you see a bubble at all gives you an indication of how hot and how much pressure is inside that little bubble, because you wouldn't get that at pressure unless it was a tremendous amount of energy. And so we have footage of that ROV dying, the other ROV shooting it, and it basically dies and floats to the top of the, I think it was on D deck. I don't remember. Please don't quote me. But it just basically just loses its neutral buoyancy because no more power keeping it floating. So it just goes up and sits there and it's dead. And we're watching all this brown gunk essentially vent out the back. And that was the battery exploding in extremely slow motion because of the pressure. And so, yeah, it was dead. And then we basically tried to figure out how to rescue it because it was, you tend to personify these little creatures. I actually am very proud. I named them Jake and Elwood.
Yeah.
I'm responsible for I won the naming contest. You kind of want to get them back. And they're useful tools. And if you can make them work, you can continue shooting. You can go deeper into the wreck and see other things.
Wow.
Jim,
plus you don't want to just leave that there.
No, it's
right?
that would be a little bit disrespectful.
Right.
It is a grave. And so, that informs the choices you make. There are times when you can be delicate. There are times when you can't be delicate. For example, the fiber optic that was spooled out of these ROVs, still in the wreck, but it decays over time and it's going to disappear faster than many things.
I did wonder about that. I was wondering, did that all get somehow pulled in as well, or so that was sort of like almost like a spider web kind of left.
Yes. Yeah. And then you retrieve the vehicle, you cut the fiber, you go to the surface.
Interesting.
So you can come out you can go in through the central hole left in the grand staircase. You can go in. That's the easiest way to get in. Then you can tour around and then you can leave through a window. And again, it falls apart. It's very thin glass essentially. So over time it's going to get brittle and it's going to break and it's going to be indistinguishable from any other detritus in the decaying wreck.
And I forget the exact number, but there's not much more time left in the Titanic sort of even existing, right? It's going to go away at some point in the near future.
Yeah. I think I wouldn't even begin to estimate how long it has. I mean, it's been down there for 100 years, and we have seen it actively decay since its discovery in what was, please forgive me, I want to say 1982. I don't remember, but when Ballard discovered the wreck and we saw the first footage to when we were on the wreck, we could see an active level of decay. It was definitely worse. And so, yes, it's being consumed by these microbes, these extremophiles, and basically they leave these things called rusticles. It's essentially just the detritus of these small creatures that eat steel. So yeah, ultimately it will just become a sort of stain on the bottom of the ocean. The engines themselves will probably be standing for another 200 or 300 years and recognizable as such, but over time they will succumb as well. But the walls of the ship were obviously thinner in some places, thicker in others. So the hull of the ship will last longer than some of the superstructure on top, which didn't have to withstand being pounded into the ocean as it crossed, but still had to survive the weather. The wood's mostly been eaten. So the interior of the wreck is very much just whatever remains that was metal, and that's being consumed.
Wow. And do you, before we we'll wind down here at this point, but do you advocate for what happened with the Titan submersible? Do you advocate for something like that, this almost tourist attraction of the Titanic, or is that sort of like, why are we doing that kind of deal?
I really don't think it has to happen.
Right.
I don't think there should be deep ocean tourism, personally. I don't think it helps anything. I don't think it's helping make people aware of what's happening in the oceans. I could be wrong there. I'm willing to admit that I'm not paying as much attention as I might. The thing is, we took 3D cameras down to that wreck. We created something you could see in IMAX. In even the best submersibles, you're looking at maybe a 5-inch window, because you can't really have a portal that's bigger than that and make it to that depth, right? Because it's weak. That portal, by the way, is going to be, I'm going to get this wrong, but if you imagine the exterior is 10 inches in diameter, the interior is going to be 3, because it needs to sit in a very large conical section of the sphere, the crew sphere, so that it sits there properly and the pressure can be distributed evenly across that surface. Because if you imagine just a window, that pressure would pop, and it would just die. So you have this super thick thing. So you can't really see out of the submersible. Going to that depth is purely bragging rights, right? Because you're not going to see much. You're going to drive around, the lights are going to be there. Hey, I saw a corner of the forward well deck. I saw the bow of the ship. We have the ability with our 3D cameras and our lighting system to shoot beautiful wide shots. We could see it sitting on the seafloor. We could take this long journey across the top, looking down in stereo. And that was actually a very, in my mind, powerful moment. The very first time we brought our footage back and we watched it, they did one pass over the forward well deck, basically from the bow up to the bridge. And the submersible's not moving fast. I want to say that that was a 14-minute take. And uninterrupted, it was amazing because it had such a sense of presence. You really did feel like you were there, and it was lit so you could see all this detail. The eye went a million places. The mind raced because you were just getting to see the entirety of it in its current state of decay. Brought up history. You're passing the crow's nest, right, which is laying flat across the deck. Oh, well, that's where Iceberg Right Ahead was called, and it's there. And it's like, here it is now. You were looking through layers of time, and you were experiencing it as directly as possible in a way I think is much more powerful than actually sitting in a sub and peeing in a bottle, for a 14-hour trip is going to do. Now, will that prevent people from going? No. Did people have to do that originally just to find it and to experience it before we could take cameras there? Yes. Ballard did that. He went there with limited tools and shot the wreck, and that's what got people excited about it. So I don't want to deny exploration, but I don't think it's worthwhile for people to make that trip for pleasure.
And that's a great point you brought up, that even if you do go down there, you're probably not going to you're not going to have that giant light
No.
that you had on Ghosts of the Abyss. So it's going to be very, very, very dark.
Yes.
Incredibly dark. So it is bragging rights, essentially. That's really all it is.
I really think it is. People, there are plenty of adrenaline junkies who want to do things. You have the people who want to climb Everest. You have people who have paid for trips into space. I don't want to deny their passions, and if they have the money and they can afford it, okay, who's going to stop you? But you have to accept a level of risk, and you don't want that risk to be stupid. And the Titan subs were just, maybe I'm being unfair and unkind, but that was a stupid death. That didn't have to happen.
It is, especially watching all the stuff leading up to it. And I mean, it's been covered, but the guy constantly saying I'm breaking rules here left and right, and Cameron's talked about it endlessly about how he was nowhere equipped to do anything like this. So
Jim will take risks, but he calculates them and keeps a safety margin that is absolutely admirable. He's not going to do anything that's going to endanger someone. It's going to be tested. It's going to be, look, accidents can always happen, but I never felt unsafe on any of his sets or at sea because I trusted him. He is part engineer, and I think he gets that from his father, who is also an engineer, and he's exposed to that culture constantly through his brother and through his own research. And so he knows the forces he's dealing with, and he will never take them for granted.
Yeah, he is quite incredible, and I would continue to talk to you, but 90 minutes we've gone for now.
Okay.
Which is great. I loved hearing yours, a treasure trove of stories. And Van did tell me you probably had a story or two to tell. So before we wrap up, I love asking new guests on the podcast.
Sure.
What is, no matter what association you have to the films, looking at all of Cameron's films, what is your number one favorite that he's made?
Well, I will tell you this. It was on Titanic, and we were on the tilting poop deck, which was the poop deck that was able to go from 0 degrees to 90 degrees. And we were nowhere near 90 degrees when I was on it. I think we were working at roughly 30 degrees. It was early on in the sequence. But things are going rough. It's hard. Asking a crew to work in that environment is very hard. And here's a good story. Maybe we're over time, but maybe you can use this in another episode or something. The grips and the electricians and the lighting crew had collectively designed this amazing thing. It was essentially a giant bounce card, and it could come out of motorized bays so that you could lift it up into the sky, and you could pull down the white, and you could bounce light off it, and you could create this beautiful even light, right? So that you could create sort of the light of the mind, because there was no moon the night Titanic sank. It was a new moon. But you still have to light. You're shooting at night, so you have to have something. But we were in Rosarito, Mexico, and there was a lot of wind. And so we're shooting, and we watch as this thing suddenly becomes a giant sail that has to basically be dropped quickly and is destroyed. Okay? They were able to salvage some things, and they basically re-engineered it to become this thing that became known as the master cylinder. And I don't know if that's a tribute to Tron or not, but it was essentially this giant round drum. So that however the wind hit it, it wouldn't be taken off of its axis. It might be pushed a little bit left, a little bit right, but it wasn't going to be ripped apart by the weather. And then they could bounce light off of that. So that became the much more effective, if cruder, solution that allowed them to continue making the movie. So that's a long sidebar to basically say these were some of the failures that we experienced. I won't say on a daily basis, but we had these massive engineering approaches that sometimes got simplified by nature. It's like, okay, you had an excellent idea, but we have more wind than you encountered. So we have to come up with a new way of working. The ship's not sinking as fast as you thought it would. So now we have to rip out deck and replace it with open grating. And all this happened so that you could keep shooting. But anyway, we're on the tilting poop deck, and there's a moment of sort of quiet, and Jim is saying, I think this is the hardest thing I've ever made. Ed, what do you think? And I looked at him and I said, everyone here can breathe. On the Abyss, everyone was on scuba. I think this is easier than the Abyss. And he sort of looked at me and said, okay, fair point. Just my opinion. And I have to say the Abyss is probably my favorite because it was my first. I was out of film school, and I was suddenly working on something of a scale that I just had not imagined existed in the world. And as I mentioned also, it sort of ruined me for other films. Like, wait, we're not shooting in the middle of an abandoned nuclear reactor? And why are we even here?
Right.
And so I have fond memories because it was the first. And I was working with good friends, Van Ling, Darren Doctorman, friends to this day. And so I'm very happy to have been involved in that.
So the Abyss takes it. I will say that is not a very popular opinion. I've had I've had a lot of guests so far. I think this is episode 17, something like that. The Abyss does not get brought up quite a lot. So to me, it rings true that the Abyss might be considered one of, if not the most underrated Cameron films.
I'm proud of my involvement with all of them. I'm proud of my involvement on Titanic because I think I helped contribute to its ultimate success. I think I helped it remain number one, perhaps for a little bit longer. I'm happy to have written the behind-the-scenes book for that film, and I think people have enjoyed experiencing everything I did on that over time. So I'm happy with that one, but I don't have quite the same personal experience. I'm happy with my work on Terminator 2, but for whatever reason, it just doesn't stick in my imagination as much. And I'm happy with my time on Ghost of the Abyss, and I have fond memories of being at sea with those people on both that and Aliens of the Deep. So each film, you're left with you're left with a pool of memory, and it'll be amazing sometimes what will trigger it. Right? You'll ask a question, and I'll say, I haven't thought of the master cylinder in years. But then in telling the story about how things were hard, that's the example that comes up. And so everything becomes an experience you can draw upon, and everything becomes a story you can share. So it's not infinite, but each film has its own special things. But if I had to pick one, I'm very happy to have been there for The Abyss, because I witnessed things I don't think I will ever witness again. You could say that's true for every other film that I've worked on with Jim, because that's the nature of how he works. But for The Abyss, every single thing was new to me. For the later films, you know, I began to recognize some of the repertoire and sort of said, all right, well, of course we're doing this, because how else were we going to do it? Whereas on The Abyss, it was all brand new to me.
Well, Ed, I look, I appreciate you coming on here and sharing all of this with me. And I need to get, what was the what was the saying on The Abyss? We need
We need an HMI on the DPV for the NTI POV ASAP.
that needs to be on a shirt. So we're hopefully that'll happen soon, because that is a beautiful shirt I want to wear very proudly.
Has anyone shared the quote T-shirts with you, or the crew videos, or any of that stuff?
No.
All right. I'll send you some links. I don't necessarily have the quote T-shirt handy, but most of the films that I've worked on with Jim have had fashion statements after the fact, which were crew T-shirts that happen to be collective sayings from people. And there's a very good one for Titanic. And I also made crew videos for a lot of these projects, and I'll send you links for the ones I have access to.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, I would have loved to see that. And if we can get in touch with John Bruno, I would be absolutely floored to have him on here.
Sure.
Similar to how I was able to get in touch with you through Van. So I thank you for coming on here. The Abyss is your favorite Cameron film. So we will end here with how I love to end every episode. I typically say watch a Cameron film, but for this one, we'll say go watch The Abyss.
Excellent.